The sea was calm that morning of June 19, 1944. Then the radar screen flickered. 1 blip. 2. 10. 50. 150 aircraft inbound, 68 miles out and closing fast. Lieutenant Frank Gill watched the scope from his cramped compartment aboard the USS Lexington, his voice steady as he keyed the radio. Scramble all fighters. Vector 270. Angels 20. The American pilots climbed into the brilliant Pacific sky, their Grumman Hellcats roaring toward an enemy they could not yet see. But the radar could see them. And that made all the difference. Below, skimming just above the waves, came Japan's finest weapon, the Nakajima B-6N Tenzin, the Heavens Mountain torpedo bomber. Fast, powerful, designed to kill capital ships with a single blow. Its pilots had trained for months, mastering the art of low-altitude attack, dropping torpedoes at speeds that would have been impossible just years before. If you find this deep dive into history fascinating, consider subscribing. We uncover the hidden turning points of World War II, the moments where technology, tactics, and human will collided to change everything. They were the inheritors of Pearl Harbor's legacy, the men who had once brought the American Pacific Fleet to its knees. But this was not December 7, 1941. This was the Philippine Sea. And above them, invisible in the glare of the sun, the Hellcats were waiting. By the time the Japanese pilots saw them, it was already too late. The sky erupted in fire. Within minutes, bombers tumbled into the sea. Their torpedoes never launched, their missions never completed. The Americans would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 346 Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed in a single day. The death of Japanese naval aviation. What had changed? How had the weapon that once terrorized the Pacific, the torpedo bomber that sank battleships and carriers alike, become so helpless, so easily slaughtered? The answer lay not in courage, not in skill, but in a technology the Japanese Navy had failed to master. Radar. The invisible shield that could see over the horizon, that could vector fighters with precision, that transformed defense from desperate scrambling into calculated execution. This is the story of how Japan's best torpedo bombers, the finest in the world at the war's beginning, met a wall of American technology they could never break. And how that failure cost them the war. To understand how the Nakajima torpedo bomber went from terror weapon to death trap, we must first understand what made it so deadly. In 1935, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a specification for a new carrier attack aircraft. It needed to carry a torpedo or bombs, operate from carriers, and outperform anything the Americans or British could field. The design team, led by Katsuji Nakamura, created the B-5N, codenamed Kate by Allied intelligence. When it first flew in January 1937, the Kate was revolutionary. It was an all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear, a rarity among carrier aircraft at the time. Its three-man crew, pilot, navigator bombardier, and radio operator gunner, worked in an enclosed greenhouse canopy, a marked improvement over the open cockpits of earlier designs. Most importantly, it was fast. With a top speed of 235 miles per hour, it could outrun most fighters of its era. The aircraft featured folding wings for carrier storage, hydraulically operated landing gear, and fabric-covered control surfaces that reduced weight while maintaining strength. The Kate first saw combat in China in 1938, supporting Japanese army operations along the coast. Combat experience revealed weaknesses, crew protection was minimal, fuel tanks were unarmored, and the aircraft was vulnerable to enemy fire. Japanese designers studied every engagement, collecting reports from pilots who had faced Chinese fighters, analyzing bullet hole patterns, measuring fuel consumption under combat conditions. The data was clear: the Kate needed improvement. But the Japanese Navy made a calculated decision. Rather than add armor, which would slow the aircraft and reduce its range, they would make it faster. If the Kate could outrun enemy interceptors, armor would be unnecessary. It was a gamble based on offensive doctrine, one that would pay dividends in 1941 but prove disastrous by 1944. The improved model, the B-5N2, entered service in 1939. It was powered by a 14-cylinder Nakajima Seiki engine producing 1,070 horsepower, giving it the speed and range to dominate the Pacific. The Seiki engine, the same power plant used in the famous Zero fighter, was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering, lightweight, powerful, and remarkably reliable. Maintenance crews could swap engines in less than 4 hours, critical for carrier operations where time meant everything. By December 1941, when war erupted, the Kate was the world's most advanced carrier-based torpedo bomber. It could carry an 18-inch Type 91 torpedo, a weapon that combined reliability with devastating power. Unlike American torpedoes, which often failed to detonate or ran erratic courses, the Japanese Type 91 was a masterpiece of engineering. The torpedo measured 18 feet in length and weighed 1,841 pounds, with a warhead containing 452 pounds of high explosive. Its underwater performance was extraordinary, maintaining course with your limits of just 1% of range, depth-keeping accuracy within 18 inches. Most remarkably, it could be dropped from considerable speed and altitude without failure. This made torpedo attacks more survivable for the aircrews, a critical advantage in combat. The Type 91 had been under continuous development since 1931, refined through countless tests and modifications. Engineers at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal experimented with different propulsion systems, warhead configurations, and guidance mechanisms. They developed an angular acceleration control system to manage roll, a sophisticated gyroscope assembly that kept the torpedo stable during water entry. This system, advanced for its time, gave Japanese torpedo bombers a reliability advantage that would prove decisive in early war engagements. But Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot waters posed a unique challenge. When dropped from altitude, torpedoes typically plunged over 90 feet before rising to attack depth. In Pearl Harbor, they would simply bury themselves in the mud. Japanese engineers solved this with wooden stabilizers attached to the tail fins, which broke away upon water entry, and the angular acceleration control system that prevented the torpedo from rolling. These modifications allowed release at speeds of over 200 miles per hour from altitudes as low as 6 to 5 feet. The wooden fins were precision machined from carefully selected timber, designed to shear away cleanly without affecting torpedo trajectory. Each torpedo required hours of preparation, its balance checked, its fins adjusted, its internal mechanisms tested repeatedly. In the months before Pearl Harbor, Japanese aviators practiced relentlessly in Kagoshima Bay, whose depth and configuration closely resembled Pearl Harbor. Flying at altitudes that terrified civilian observers, pilots dove their Kates toward the water at speeds approaching the aircraft's limits. They trained Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Friday, as one pilot joked, 7 days a week. The training was conducted openly, with hundreds of thousands of civilians watching from the city, yet American intelligence never grasped its significance. Some pilots flew so low their propellers churned the water into spray, practicing the razor-edge precision required for shallow water torpedo drops. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 40 Kate torpedo bombers led the first wave against Pearl Harbor. They launched from altitudes between 50 and 100 feet, their specially modified torpedoes running true through the shallow water. The results were catastrophic for the Americans. The battleships California, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Nevada were all hit by torpedoes and sank or were severely damaged. Each torpedo strike produced a massive underwater explosion, rupturing hull plates, flooding compartments, sending shock waves through steel that tore machinery from its mounts and killed men hundreds of feet from the impact point. High-level bombers, also flying Kates but carrying armor-piercing bombs converted from artillery shells, added to the destruction. One such bomb penetrated the USS Arizona's forward magazine, detonating over 1 million pounds of powder in a cataclysmic explosion that killed 1,177 men instantly. The explosion lifted the Arizona's bow, snapped the ship in half, and created a fireball visible for miles. In total, 103 Kate bombers participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, 40 armed with torpedoes and the remainder with bombs. Together, they inflicted more damage than any other aircraft type that day, sinking or crippling 8 battleships and demonstrating the Kate's devastating effectiveness. The success continued through 1942. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, Kate torpedo bombers from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku attacked the American carrier Lexington. Torpedoes struck below the waterline, flooding compartments and igniting aviation fuel. Though Lexington remained afloat initially, internal explosions eventually forced her abandonment. She became the first American fleet carrier lost in combat. The attack demonstrated perfect coordination, dive bombers suppressing anti-aircraft fire while torpedo bombers approached from multiple angles, splitting the defensive fire and ensuring hits. 1 month later, at Midway, Kate's armed with torpedoes helped cripple the carrier Yorktown, which was later finished off by a Japanese submarine. And at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October, Kate torpedo bombers struck the carrier Hornet repeatedly, eventually sending her to the bottom. These were not lucky hits. They were the product of rigorous training, excellent equipment, and pilots who had mastered the art of low-altitude attack. Yet even in 1942, warning signs emerged. Kate Cruz suffered heavy losses at Midway, where American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shredded Japanese formations. The problem was not the aircraft itself, it was the emergence of coordinated American defenses. Radar-directed fighter interceptions began to appear, crude at first, but improving with each engagement. The Americans had begun deploying radar on major warships in 1940. The CXAM system, installed on battleships, carriers, and cruisers, operated at 200 MHz and could detect aircraft at 50 miles or more. The antenna, a distinctive 17 by 18-foot bedspring array mounted on a rotating yoke, swept the horizon continuously. Early operators struggled with the equipment, interpreting blips on primitive oscilloscope displays, distinguishing aircraft from weather returns, calculating ranges from imprecise measurements. But with each battle, the system improved. At the Coral Sea in May 1942, the Lexington's CXAM radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft at 68 miles, giving fighter directors precious minutes to position defending Wildcats. The detection did not prevent the attack. American fighters were too few and too slow, but it proved the concept. Radar could see over the horizon. Radar could provide warning. And with warning came the possibility of coordinated defense. By Midway in June, radar operators had refined their techniques, identifying raid sizes, estimating altitudes, tracking multiple formations simultaneously. American fighter direction was still primitive, vectoring instructions imprecise, but the foundation was being laid. The Japanese Navy, focused on offensive doctrine and the decisive battle, failed to recognize the significance. They saw radar as a defensive technology, useful perhaps for screening ships or detecting submarines, but not essential to winning battles. The Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval thinking for decades, emphasized striking first, striking hard, and annihilating the enemy fleet in a single climactic engagement. Defense was what you did when offense failed, and offense was not supposed to fail. This mindset proved fatal. By 1943, the Kate was being replaced by its successor, the Nakajima B-6N Tenzin, codenamed Jill by the Allies. The Jill was faster, with a top speed of 299 miles per hour, and had significantly longer range. It carried the same deadly Type 91 torpedo but could deliver it from greater distances, theoretically improving crew survivability. The B-6N incorporated lessons from the Kate's combat experience. It had a more powerful engine, the Mitsubishi Casey producing 1,850 horsepower, and improved handling characteristics. Yet it retained the same fundamental vulnerability: no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal defensive armament. The design philosophy remained unchanged: speed and agility over protection. The Jill entered service in August 1943, deployed to frontline units aboard carriers of the 3rd Fleet at Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Production ramped slowly, never exceeding 90 aircraft per month, and the total built by war's end would be just 1,268 aircraft. The intent was to gradually replace all B-5N Kate bombers, creating a more capable strike force. But the Jills were committed to battle prematurely when Allied naval activity in the Solomon Islands indicated an invasion at Bougainville. Operation Arrow brought nearly all carrier aircraft from the 1st Carrier Division to reinforce land-based units at Rabaul, including 40 B-6NS. The results were disastrous. American fighters, now guided by increasingly effective radar, intercepted the Japanese formations before they could reach their targets. The Jills, despite their improved performance, were shot down in numbers that shocked Japanese commanders. The problem was clear: the aircraft were excellent, but they were being fed into a defensive system they could not overcome. The American advantage was not just better aircraft, though the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter was superior to the aging Zero. The real advantage was integration, radar detection, fighter direction, and combat air patrol coordination had become a seamless system. Japanese torpedo bombers, flying low and slow during their attack runs, were perfect targets for Hellcats vectored precisely to intercept them. And the Japanese had no equivalent system to warn their own pilots or coordinate their defenses. By early 1944, American shipboard radar had evolved into a formidable capability. The SK and SK-2 air search radars, operating at 200 MHz with peak power output of 200 to 250 kilowatts, could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Their distinctive rectangular bedspring antennas, mounted high on carrier superstructures, swept the horizon continuously, painting every aircraft within range onto cathode ray tubes below. This was not the crude experimental equipment of 1941. This was mature, reliable technology operated by trained specialists who had refined their craft through years of combat. The radar operators fed information to plotters in the Combat Information Center, who transferred contacts onto large plexiglass displays. Each raid was numbered, its bearing, range, altitude, and estimated size carefully tracked. Friendly fighters were shown in a different color, their positions updated moment by moment. Fighter direction officers studied these displays, calculating intercept courses, allocating assets, directing the battle from a climate-controlled room deep within the ship. It was warfare at a level of abstraction the Japanese Navy had never achieved. To American fighter direction officers, the battle was not chaos, it was geometry. Vectors, angles, closure rates. They spoke to pilots in calm, precise language, guiding them onto targets they could not yet see. Bogey, bearing 270, range 40 miles, Angels 15. Vector 290, Buster. The fighters would turn, open their throttles, climb to intercept altitude. By the time the Japanese pilots saw the Hellcats, they were already in gun range. The system allowed for instantaneous reinforcement of combat air patrols. Whenever one division was committed to an interception, more fighters launched immediately, ensuring continuous coverage. The Japanese, by contrast, relied on visual detection and voice communication. Lookouts scanned the sky with binoculars, fleet formations spread wide to extend detection range. When enemy aircraft appeared, screening ships fired their main guns in the direction of the threat, alerting fighters by sound and smoke puffs. Fighter direction consisted of shouted commands and hand signals. It was the naval warfare of 1942, valiant but obsolete. Against radar-directed defenses, it was suicide. The Japanese Navy was not ignorant of radar technology. Prototype ship-based radars had been tested as early as 1941, mounted on the battleship's eyes and Hyuga. But these early systems were crude, unreliable, and deployed too late to influence major battles. The sets could detect ships at moderate range but struggled with aircraft, their returns often lost in clutter or atmospheric noise. Inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy fragmented research efforts. The Army ordered its radar group at the Toma Army Technical Institute to divulge no results to the Navy, and the Navy soon reciprocated. Resources were wasted on duplicate projects and long-term research that could not be completed before war's end. By 1945, Japan had 64 fixed early warning radars scattered across the home islands, but at least 11 sites had Navy and Army radars side by side, duplication born of distrust rather than need. More fundamentally, Japanese naval doctrine did not prioritize defensive technology. The concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, emphasized offensive striking power. Carriers existed to deliver devastating blows against enemy fleets, not to defend themselves. Radar was seen as a defensive tool, useful perhaps, but secondary to torpedoes, bombs, and the skill of pilots. Recruiting technical personnel was difficult. There was one 6-year period when not a single graduate of Tokyo Imperial University's engineering department volunteered for Navy duty. The cultural emphasis on combat roles over technical specialties meant Japan's best minds went elsewhere. This mindset proved fatal. By June 1944, when Operation Eigo, the decisive battle for the Marianas, was launched, the Japanese mobile fleet carried 9 carriers with over 400 aircraft. It was the largest carrier force Japan had assembled since Midway. But it faced an American fleet with 15 carriers, over 900 aircraft, and most critically, a radar-directed defense system that had been perfected through 2 years of continuous combat. The stage was set for the Philippine Sea. On one side, Japanese torpedo bombers, the finest carrier attack aircraft their nation could produce, flown by pilots who still believed in the offensive spirit, in courage and skill overcoming technological advantage. On the other, an American fleet wrapped in an invisible shield of electromagnetic waves, where every approaching aircraft was tracked, every fighter vectored with precision, where defense had become a science. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Taiho, on the morning of June 19, 1944. Around him stretched the first mobile fleet, 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers. Over 400 aircraft crowded the carrier decks, their engines warming for the decisive battle Japan had awaited since Midway. This was Operation Eigo. This was the moment when Japanese naval aviation would shatter American ambitions in the Pacific. Or so Ozawa believed. He knew the Americans held numerical superiority, 15 carriers to his 9. But Ozawa had advantages. His aircraft, particularly the Zeros and the new Jill torpedo bombers, had greater range than their American counterparts. He could strike from distances beyond American reach, a shuttle attack, hitting the enemy fleet, landing at Guam to rearm and refuel, then striking again on the return flight. Japanese land-based aircraft from Guam, Rota, and Tinian would add their strength to the assault, over 100 bombers and fighters. Together, they would overwhelm the American defenses through sheer numbers and relentless pressure. What Ozawa did not know, what he could not know without adequate radar, was that American submarines had been shadowing his fleet for days, reporting every course change, every refueling stop. He did not know that American carrier-based fighters had already decimated the land-based aircraft he was counting on, reducing them to scattered remnants. And he did not know that 68 miles away, on the screens of American radar operators, his first strike wave was already painted, tracked, analyzed. The Americans were ready. The Japanese were blind. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from the carrier Lexington. Unlike Ozawa, Mitcher had near-perfect situational awareness. Submarines provided continuous intelligence on Japanese fleet movements. Long-range patrol bombers, flying from Saipan, had spotted Ozawa's carriers at dawn and reported their position. Most importantly, shipboard radar gave Mitcher something Ozawa could never have: time. At 10:15 in the morning, radar operators aboard the carriers detected the first Japanese strike, 150 aircraft inbound from the west. They were still 68 miles away, roughly 20 minutes flying time. Mitcher's fighter direction officers immediately began vectoring combat air patrol fighters toward the threat. Additional Hellcats launched from every carrier in the task force, their pilots climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. By the time the Japanese formation reached 50 miles, over 70 Hellcats were airborne and positioned between the enemy and the fleet. The Japanese pilots never had a chance to organize their attack. The Hellcats tore into them from above, diving out of the sun with 650 caliber machine guns blazing. The heavily armed American fighters, each mounting 6 Browning machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition, could shred a lightly built Japanese aircraft in seconds. Zeros tried to protect the torpedo bombers and dive bombers, but they were outnumbered and outfought. The Hellcat was faster, could dive better, and was far more rugged. Armor plating protected the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires, and the aircraft could absorb tremendous battle damage and still fly home. Pilots reported Zeros disintegrating under short bursts, wings folding, fuselages exploding in flames. The Japanese torpedo bombers, flying low as their doctrine demanded, were the most vulnerable. A torpedo run required straight and level flight at low altitude and moderate speed, the perfect target for a diving fighter. Hellcat pilots selected the Jills first, knowing they posed the greatest threat to the carriers below. Machine gun fire ripped through wings, shattered cockpits, ignited fuel tanks. Within minutes, over half the torpedo bombers in the first wave were burning wreckage tumbling into the sea. Crews had no time to react. The attacks came from behind and above, the first indication often the sound of bullets tearing through aluminum. A few made it through the fighter screen, but they encountered a wall of anti-aircraft fire unlike anything Japanese pilots had experienced. American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired coordinated barrages, their 5-inch guns equipped with the new proximity fuse, a radar-triggered device that detonated shells when they neared an aircraft. The sky filled with lethal black bursts. Torpedo bombers that survived the fighters flew into this storm of steel and were shredded. Of the 150 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 returned to their carriers. Not a single American ship was hit. The second wave fared no better. 98 aircraft were detected at 11:30, 56 miles out. Once again, fighter direction officers calmly vectored Hellcats to intercept. Once again, the Japanese formation was torn apart before reaching the fleet. 97 aircraft were destroyed. Some pilots, seeing the massacre, jettisoned their torpedoes and bombs early, fleeing at maximum speed. It made no difference. The Hellcats hunted them down individually, methodical executioners eliminating targets one by one. The third wave, 4 to 7 aircraft, met the same fate, attacked by Hellcats while still 70 miles from the American carriers. 40 aircraft were lost. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, was detected late in the afternoon. By this time, American fighter direction had become so efficient that the Japanese were intercepted over 75 miles from the fleet. 73 aircraft were destroyed. Fighter directors aboard different carriers coordinated their intercepts, dividing the raid into sectors, ensuring no enemy formation went unopposed. It was systematic, clinical, devastating. By the end of June 19, 346 Japanese carrier aircraft had been shot down. American losses totaled 23 Hellcats. The kill ratio was 15-1. Aviators on the returning American fighters reported the action with gallows humor. It was like shooting turkeys, one pilot radioed. The phrase stuck. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese, it was annihilation. Ozawa's flagship, the carrier Taiho, was struck by a torpedo from the American submarine Albacore during the morning of the 19th. Damage control seemed to have the situation under control, but aviation fuel fumes accumulated in the ventilation systems. At 3:30 in the afternoon, a massive explosion tore the ship apart. Ozawa was forced to transfer his flag to a destroyer, losing hours of command and control at a critical moment. The carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and the Eastern Solomons, was torpedoed by the submarine Kavala. 3 underwater explosions ripped open her hull. 4 hours later, she rolled over and sank, taking 1,200 men with her. On June 20th, American carrier aircraft located the retreating Japanese fleet and launched a late afternoon strike, 216 aircraft flying into the setting sun. They sank the carrier Hayo, damaged the carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda, and sent 2 fleet oilers to the bottom. The cost was high, 80 American aircraft were lost, most running out of fuel during the return flight in darkness. But Mitchell ordered every ship in the task force to turn on its lights, guiding the lost pilots home. It was a calculated risk, revealing the fleet's position to potential submarine attack. But Mitchell valued his pilots more than operational security. Pilots later described the sight as miraculous. Hundreds of ships illuminated against the dark Pacific, searchlights sweeping the sky, every deck light blazing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers and over 400 aircraft. Most devastating was the loss of trained pilots and aircrew. These were not rookies, these were men with months or years of experience, the survivors of earlier battles, the instructors who should have trained the next generation. Their deaths created a void that could never be filled. Japan's remaining carriers would sail with skeletal air groups, their decks mostly empty, their combat effectiveness reduced to near zero. For the Americans, the victory was overwhelming. The Marianas could now be secured without fear of Japanese naval interference. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell in the following weeks, providing bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers that would soon rain fire on Japanese cities. The strategic implications were immediate and catastrophic for Japan. But the tactical lesson was equally important. Radar-directed fighter defense had proven devastatingly effective. The Japanese torpedo bomber, once the terror of the Pacific, was now obsolete, not because the aircraft was inferior, but because the defensive system it faced had evolved beyond its ability to penetrate. As we reach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on how technology shapes war. If you've learned something new today, if this perspective on the Pacific War has given you a deeper understanding, please subscribe and share this video. History isn't just battles and dates, it's the moments where everything changed, and we're dedicated to bringing you those stories. Some tried to continue. By late 1944, remaining Kate and Jill bombers were relegated to secondary roles, anti-submarine patrols, training missions, reconnaissance. The few that remained operational carried primitive radar sets for submarine hunting, flying just 30 to 40 feet above the waves, searching for submarines that might threaten Japanese convoys. The radar sets, borrowed from destroyed ships and modified for aircraft installation, were temperamental and required expert operators. Pilots flew for hours, eyes straining at the waves, knowing they were hunting enemies they had little chance of finding. It was a humiliating end for an aircraft type that had once dominated the Pacific. The final indignity came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation were used as a decoy force. 18 torpedo bombers and a handful of fighters launched from carriers stripped of most their aircraft, sacrificed to lure American carriers away from the landing beaches. They were annihilated without effect. Most pilots knew it was a suicide mission, but they launched anyway, following orders, honoring their oath to emperor and nation. None returned. By 1945, Japan's carrier fleet existed only on paper. The carriers survived, but the air groups were gone, the pilots dead or transferred to kamikaze units. The torpedo bombers that remained were parked in hidden airfields, camouflaged under trees, waiting for fuel that would never arrive, for missions that would never be flown. Some aircraft were cannibalized for parts, their engines removed to keep a few operational for training. Others simply rotted, aluminum corroding, tires deflating, cockpits filling with rainwater. On August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing Japan's surrender, a few dozen Kates and Jills still existed. Most would be scrapped or burned. Only a handful survived, and today, not a single flyable example remains. The aircraft that once terrorized Pearl Harbor exists only in photographs, museum displays, and the memories of men who flew them or fought against them. The lessons of the Philippine Sea echoed far beyond 1944. After the war, every major navy recognized that carrier task forces required integrated air defense systems combining radar, fighter direction, and coordinated anti-aircraft fire. The technology that had given America such overwhelming advantage became standard doctrine worldwide. The British developed their own combat information centers, the Soviets invested heavily in radar and surface-to-air missiles, and every nation that fielded carriers understood that without integrated defense, those carriers were helpless. Even today, naval task forces operate on principles established in the Philippine Sea: early warning, intercept coordination, lead defense. The electromagnetic spectrum became as important as the visible one, and any nation that could not master it would be helpless in modern naval combat. Aegis cruisers, with their phased array radars and computer-controlled weapon systems, are the direct descendants of the fighter direction officers who vectored Hellcats in 1944. The technology is vastly more sophisticated, but the concept is identical: detect, track, intercept, destroy. For Japan, the failure was not just technological. It was doctrinal. The Imperial Navy's obsession with the offensive, with the decisive battle, with spiritual strength overcoming material disadvantage, blinded them to the reality of modern warfare. Defense was not a secondary consideration, it was existential. An undefended fleet, no matter how powerful its striking arm, was doomed. The philosophy that had served Japan well in earlier eras, the emphasis on Bushido, on offensive spirit, on accepting death rather than dishonor, could not compensate for systemic technological inferiority. The torpedo bomber pilots who flew into the guns at the Philippine Sea were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were simply asked to accomplish the impossible, to penetrate a defensive system their nation had failed to match. And they paid the price in blood. Many knew, as they approached the American fleet, that they would not return. Some wrote farewell letters before launching, addressed to parents or wives, accepting death as inevitable. Others prayed, or sang songs, or simply focused on the mission, determined to make their deaths meaningful. In the end, the story of Japan's torpedo bombers is not one of technological inferiority. The Kate and Jill were excellent aircraft, perhaps the finest torpedo bombers of their generation. Their pilots were skilled, dedicated, and brave. But excellence in isolation is not enough. In modern war, systems defeat weapons. Integration defeats specialization. And the side that can see over the horizon, coordinate across hundreds of miles, and adapt in real time will triumph over even the most dedicated warriors. The Philippine Sea was the final proof. Japan's best torpedo bombers could not break America's radar shield because the shield was not a single technology. It was an entire system, hardware, software, training, doctrine, all working together seamlessly. The Japanese never built that system. They never prioritized it. And by the time they understood its importance, it was too late. The war was lost. Not in one battle, but across thousands of decisions made in boardrooms and laboratories, in training schools and research facilities, in the allocation of resources and the setting of priorities. The Americans had invested in radar early, recognizing its potential even when the technology was crude and unreliable. They had trained operators, developed doctrine, created the Combat Information Center concept, and integrated everything into a coherent defensive system. The Japanese had focused on offensive weapons, on better torpedoes and faster aircraft, assuming that striking first and striking hard would be enough. It was a fundamental miscalculation that cost them everything. If this story has shown you something you never knew about the Second World War, if you're fascinated by how technology and tactics intertwine to determine the fate of nations, then this channel is for you. We go deeper than surface narratives. We examine the details that textbooks miss, the human stories behind the statistics, the moments where everything changed. Subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the hidden history of the greatest conflict the world has ever known. The waters of the Philippine Sea are calm today. Beneath them lie the wrecks of carriers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft, Japanese and American alike. The men who fought there, the ones who survived, carried the memories for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it with pride, others with sorrow, a few with shame. But all understood they had witnessed something profound, the moment when one era of warfare ended and another began. The age of the torpedo bomber, the age of close-range naval combat, the age when courage and skill alone could turn the tide, all of it died in the skies above the Marianas. What replaced it was colder, more calculated, more dependent on technology and systems. But it was also more effective. And in war, effectiveness is all that matters. The Romantics mourned the passing of individual heroism, of aces and dogfights and personal skill mattering more than equipment. But the realists understood that war is about winning, and winning requires leveraging every advantage, technological, tactical, and strategic. The Japanese torpedo bombers, for all their excellence, belonged to a world that no longer existed. They were the finest weapons of 1941, flown into the battles of 1944. And against radar, against fighter direction, against an integrated defense system, they never stood a chance. History remembers them as victims of the turkey shoot, but that description misses the deeper truth. They were not just victims of superior numbers or better aircraft. They were victims of a technological revolution their nation failed to join. And in the end, that failure cost Japan everything. The lesson transcends World War II. In any conflict, technological advantage matters, but integrated systems matter more. A single brilliant weapon, unsupported by infrastructure and doctrine, will fail. A network of adequate weapons, properly coordinated and employed, will succeed. The side that understands this, that invests not just in hardware but in the training, doctrine, and integration necessary to employ it effectively, will win. The side that does not will lose, no matter how brave its warriors, no matter how advanced its individual weapons.